This is a webinar that is run by the Incubator in Clinical Education Research. This was set up a few years ago by the NIHR to try and encourage more more clinicians, particularly, and others to get involved in clinical education research. And as an incubator, we run a series of training events. This is the Getting Started series, so this is very much for novice researchers. If you're a more experienced researcher, you're very welcome to stay and join and input, or welcome all levels. But this is particularly for those who have done no or very little clinical education research, and that's who we've set it up for. But for those of you more experienced, the incubator does run some Mastering the Basics and other things for medium career researchers, and then actually run some supervisor sessions as well. So hopefully there will be some training for any level of educational researchers. So this was set up a few years ago. This series this is our third year we're running it, and it's a monthly webinar. We know that many of you will be busy doing clinical and other jobs, so we try and make it as easy as possible to attend. So it's a monthly webinar. The website has the exact dates. We try and vary the lunchtime so those people who are particularly busy on different days can attend. This one obviously is an introduction, and then the titles are all on the website, but we look at how to write a research question, different methodologies, different types of analysis, how to get published, how to get ethics and PPI input, etc. So hopefully a little bit of a taster of everything. Obviously, in a 1 hour webinar, we can't go into detail, but I hope it just gives you a bit of a taster and some pointers of where to go. So you're all very, very welcome. My name's Hugh Alberti. I'm a GP and Professor of GP Education at Newcastle University. And our speaker today is Megan Brown, who will introduce herself shortly. I wonder, it's really interesting, maybe I'm just nosy, but it's really interesting to know who's on the web in the webinar. So if you don't mind, in the chat box, just a simple pop your name, who you are and where you work. And we found that actually some people have managed to link up with others in the same area or in the same subject area just by knowing who else is on the call. So if you don't mind doing that on the chat box in the next couple of minutes, then please do. Megan's going to do a bit of a talk to set the scene. And after that, there will be some opportunities for some discussion groups and for some questions and answers as well. Just a couple of boring practicalities. If you don't mind putting yourself on mute for the presentation, and then obviously in the discussion groups, whether we do that as a big group or little groups, then feel free to unmute. Do use the chat box for questions, even during the talk, but especially afterwards. And video is very much optional. If you wish to, then please do go ahead and put the video on. But I know, again, many of you may be in clinical settings, etc., where it's less appropriate. So that's absolutely fine not to have your video on. And I mentioned this again at the end, but any feedback or any requests for certificates for attendance, etc., then email the incubator email address, which we'll make sure is in the chat box as well. And I think that's more than enough waffle for myself. So I will now pass you over to Megan to start us off.
Thanks, Hugh, and hi everybody and welcome. It's great to see so many of you join us today on what I imagine is many of your lunch breaks. So my name is Megan Brown. I'm a senior, a postdoctoral research fellow in medical education research at Newcastle University with Hugh. And today we're exploring the fundamentals of clinical education research. That's really an introduction to what clinical education research is, why it matters, and how you might be able to position yourself in the field as somebody who is starting their own research journey. I've got 3 key messages today that I want to flag and that hopefully you will leave here with, and we'll add some detail and colour to you throughout the webinar. The first is the importance of a network of peers and colleagues, and I can hear the chat going off. I can hear you beginning to make those connections. We also have a directory of experts and those interested and engaged in clinical education research, which I will mention later in the presentation, so you can begin to make connections either with people at the same level or with mentors and those who can offer advice and guidance. Start small is the sort of second tip that you'll see the small ways in which we might begin to become familiar with clinical education research to build and develop our own knowledge. We don't have to hit the ground running every single time. And I'm not going to be talking about how you can design big full projects today. I'm really going to be talking about how you can begin becoming familiar with the landscape, with the terminology, which will enable you to read the literature, to engage and to begin thinking. And that thinking is work, and it's very important work. And it is the first sort of small step that we can take on our research journeys. As part of that thinking, I would flag that be prepared to be uncomfortable, to have your own assumptions challenged, feel out of your depth. You might feel some of that today, hopefully not. We've tried to pitch this at an entry level, but you almost certainly will feel that as you read the literature. I still feel that sometimes and can remember feeling that very frequently as I was getting started. That's completely normal and okay. This is a different field and a different language than from where many of us have come up through clinical professions. It does take some getting used to and getting familiar with. And that is the sort of structure of what we'll cover today, what clinical education research is, how it brings together professionals of diverse backgrounds. I can't see the chat because I'm presenting, but I imagine that we've already got a flavour of some of those diverse backgrounds there in the chat. What the key terms are that we use to navigate this field and how we can find out more about those. Obviously, in an hour today, we can't go through every term, but we'll give you a taster. And how clinical education research can meaningfully influence practice. So this isn't something which is disconnected from what we do on a day-to-day basis as educators or as clinical practitioners who might come into contact with students and learners. Clinical education research begins with clinical education. That might seem like an obvious statement, but you would be surprised. But why does
Megan, I'm
education...
sorry to
Oh yeah,
interrupt,
sorry.
Megan. Yeah, no worries. Yeah, 10 minutes ago your slides were going forward lovely before everyone joined,
They're
and
not
now I think
working
we're
now.
still stuck on the first slide. But I don't know whether that's
Okay.
because I can do that, so that's me moving them forward. But
Oh,
I'm
sorry
not
about that. They're
sure.
moving
Why
forward for
does
me.
clinical education matter
Yeah,
slide? Is that
it might be
Try
you if you've moved them forwards and backwards. You might
yeah,
have got
yeah, try
yourself
it
out of
again.
sync.
Absolutely, try it again because I think I might. There you go. Now you've got the power.
Okay, right. Thank you,
So,
Hugh. Thanks for
apologies,
flagging that. It's
everyone.
good that everyone can see. No, it's okay. Um, okay, so back to clinical education and why it matters. As many of us know, this clinical education serves as individuals' first formal point of entry into professions that involve caring for patients. And it is where we create and instill values in learners. It's where learners form their perspectives on what it means to be a healthcare professional, what it means to treat people, and how it means to treat educators and students who come up behind them. So I'm using doctors here as an example. So I have a medical background myself, although I haven't practiced for quite some years. The thing to flag would be that clinical education research is something that is broader than only medical education. I would see medical education as being something that is situated within clinical education research that covers lots of different professions. But training and education is often sort of this black box. So you get people into the profession, they're admitted to a training environment like medical school, then something happens that influences the practice of graduates who go on to have really important roles, as we all know, in patients' care. But we often don't know exactly what's happening on that ground level, where people are forming values, where they're forming perspectives that they take forward into practice. And we need to know and unpack that black box so we can understand. And that understanding then enables us to make improvements that can have that meaningful impact on patient care as people carry forward that improved practice into their clinical care. The way that we do that, the way that we unpack that black box is through clinical education research. So you might see clinical education research abbreviated to ClinEdR. And that's the study of how we teach, learn, and assess in health and social care settings. That might be at the undergraduate university level. It might be across the whole continuum of that education, including at that postgraduate level, once people are in practice and training. Done well, clinical education research improves how professionals are trained, and ultimately, as we've spoken about, that improves patient care. And it also gives us the language and the evidence to challenge often quite deeply baked in, ingrained assumptions about what good teaching and learning look like in busy clinical environments. So as you'll see on the slide, we've got our website there. That's a QR code that hopefully, fingers crossed, if I've set it up correctly, will take you to the incubator website where we have more detail and information on what we mean by clinical education research, different types. There's lots more resources on the website that I'd encourage you to check out, but that's a really good way to get started. And a few highlights from that information would be that clinical education research is research which has the understanding or evaluation of any aspect of clinical education as the primary focus. And as you can probably appreciate, that's very broad, but essentially needs to be the focus of the work. Lots of work will touch on education or recommend education as something that needs to happen after the research, but here it takes center stage and it's the star of the show. It asks questions of that clinical education about what works, for who, how does something work, why, what context does something work in. And I quite like this. It can be seen to be the scholarship of discovery. So having that curiosity, unpicking and developing that understanding of education and training so that we can make a change, make a difference to learners, to educators, to patients is really at the heart of what clinical education research is. It sort of sits at a crossroads of education, social science, psychology, and clinical practice. And we borrow methods from all of those fields, but we're also a field all on our own and a younger field, admittedly, but we are beginning to develop our own methods and language. And so some of the presentation today will clue you in to some of those key emerging ideas. There's a wide range of professionals that are involved in clinical education research. Lots of medics, admittedly, medical education is quite well represented. I would include myself in that umbrella. But there are allied healthcare professionals. These are just some of the people that I work with and have collaborated with in the past. Non-clinical people as a very broad umbrella, which would include previously clinical individuals like myself, sociologists, educationalists, psychologists. And what I would flag is that this is a wonderful, supportive community and network of people. So if you're looking for that sense of belonging and for a professional academic home, this is a fantastic place. I'm obviously very biased because I work in the field, but this is a fantastic place to develop that sense of teamwork with other individuals and to do work that matters and can make a real difference because you're intervening at such an early point in the development of people's ideas. There's a huge scope for impact and change sometimes because we're a few steps removed from patient care. That's not always obvious, but there is a lot of potential for clinical education to make a difference. This is my very simplistic understanding, although it maybe doesn't look simplistic when I've laid it all out in pictures, of what clinical education research does. We often talk about the differences between quantitative research that involves numbers and qualitative research that involves words and stories, and they may be terms that you've already seen within your clinical work and clinical research. And there's a lot of debate about the position and value of both that I won't get into. But my understanding and how this maps onto clinical education research is that when you think about quantitative research, something like a survey, it gives you the jigsaw frame outline of a picture. All of our research is building a picture, building that understanding. And the size of the frame of that jigsaw, of that picture, it's going to determine how big that picture is. And the survey can help give you that outline. It scopes how big the picture is that you're looking at. We will know what we need to fill in. We'll know the size of what we then need to fill in once we have that understanding of how big the frame is. And we can begin to put in these coloured jigsaw pieces, which I see more as the qualitative contributions, to begin to create a 3D model about how something spins and pivots. We can ask questions about that. We can look at this 3D model from different angles, and that's what qualitative research helps us do. We can look at different stories, diverse narratives, and diverse experiences that help us move that 3D model around and develop our understanding of the sides that maybe we can't see from where we're originally standing. Over time, we can develop our understanding of what that means, and that helps us turn this abstract shape, this abstract 3D model, into a lion. I mean, that seems like quite a big stretch from that blue blob, doesn't it? But as you develop an understanding of what those stories mean in context for lots of different individuals, as you develop an understanding that maybe there isn't just one correct way to do this or one correct truth, there are lots of individuals with diverse perspectives. Bringing all that together can help us interpret that 3D model into what it means. In this case, it's a lion, but in research, obviously, it will cover lots of different topics in terms of what those stories mean to people and how that then should influence our educational practice. This is why language is very important to us. There's a lot of meaning making within clinical education research. There's lots of people working on different bits of that 3D model from different perspectives. So having a shared glossary to bring together some collective understanding as to how we can be consistent as a field in presenting our work, we felt was very important. This wasn't something that we had. It's something that the incubator developed. I think it was around a year, it might even be longer ago now. We have lots of terms that we've brought in from other fields, but also our own language. And on the next slide, there is another QR code. It's death by QR code slightly, this presentation, so apologies in advance for that. Of the glossary, this will take you to a research paper, which I'll flash up on screen in a moment once people have had time to scan this code, which is a glossary of clinical education research terminology. It's a very big paper and it has a massive table in it full of lots of different terms. They're organized alphabetically. It's not exhaustive, but it's a big start in chipping away at the meaning of the language that we use. And I'm sure you'll be familiar with some of these terms. Some of them might be completely new, which is completely fine. This is what the paper looks like when you open the link. And when you scroll down through the paper, you'll come to this massive table, which will talk you through the definition of some key terms. It gives you a summary of that longer definition, but it also gives you links to further reading. So if there is something that you want to know more about, this is a really good way of opening that door to clinical education research and the language that is used. These are some of the key terms from that glossary, and they're key terms that are going to lead you to very contested spaces within clinical education research. There's quite a lot of different lenses, and I'll go through what I mean by that we use in clinical education research, and these terms will help you develop your understanding. So please don't be put off by these. I anticipate that there'll be new terms to lots of people. These were all completely new to me when I started in clinical education research, and I'm going to walk through them. What you'll notice is that these are quite philosophical. So if anyone's interested in philosophy, you might see some of the roots and the origins of these terms, and that is a field that we've borrowed from to develop this language. And these terms we most often use in relation to our methods, so that there's something it's really important to think about, even at this early stage, as you get started, thinking about how you relate to these terms, how you feel about them, where you sit on the spectrum of research for these terms, will help you develop rigorous research, rigorous ideas. And doing that right from the off will help you have develop research and undertake research that's more likely to have an impact. I know myself, when I was getting started, often you have a great idea and you want to rush forward and you go, yeah, that's it. I need to do a survey, or I need to speak to XYZ person about this. But taking a bit of time and putting in that time up front to developing an understanding of, actually, is a survey the best approach, or do I need to do some interviews? What am I more interested in? What type of data is going to help me answer that question? Knowledge of these terms and knowing where you stand right from the off will help you do that in a more efficient way and a more rigorous way. So there are different ways of seeing the world. Again, that seems like an obvious statement, but it also holds true within research. There are different lenses that we can look at research through. This image on screen is one of those trick images where it can look like a duck or a rabbit, depending on how you look at it. And you can probably see it both ways. So if you originally saw this as a rabbit, have a go at looking at it as a duck, and vice versa. Because when you think of duck, you'll see duck. hopefully, or I do anyway. When you think of rabbit, you'll see a rabbit. And that's an example of when you apply a lens to the way that you see something, you can be flexible and you can shift and change your approach. And we can think of those lenses, we can refer to them, and we do refer to them within clinical education as paradigms. So why are paradigms important? Reflecting on our paradigms is really important within clinical education research as they guide the design of our research. How we see the world, how we see a problem will influence how we investigate that problem. These are assumptions that are always present. We're always seeing the world through some sort of lens, even if we think that we are being really objective and independent and neutral about something. Actually, that's a specific way that we are seeing the world and are seeing how we can work out what something means or what something is. So we always have these assumptions, so we should reflect on them and make them clear to other people, because that helps a reader understand our work, where we're coming from, and make sense of it within their own context. There's a great quote here that the power of an experiment, I mean experiment very broadly, because not our most of our work within clinical education is not experimental, is only as strong as the clarity of the basic assumptions that underlie it. So essentially, to have power, and I don't mean kind of statistical power or any sort of specific definition, I mean on a broad level, to have impact and power from the research that you do, we need to make clear those basic assumptions, those paradigms that we're looking at the world through. And as I said, they allow for people reading your work to make much quicker and easier sense. If I can say, I see the world this way, that's how this has informed my research, and that's why I'm doing a survey, and that's why I'm doing interviews. That's part of rigor within our field. So paradigms are that set of beliefs and values about how we see the world, but there's various building blocks. There's different things that go into creating that lens that we've got in our glasses that's informing how we see things. There are ideas about what's real, what can we therefore know about, and what we value in inquiry. And you'll see these terms being thrown around: ontology, about what's real; knowledge based, about what counts as knowledge, is sometimes known as epistemology. And what we value in inquiry is talked about as axiology. And I'll go through those on a slightly later slide in more depth. But they're the essential building blocks, and we can reflect on each of those individually to work out where we sit on this spectrum of approaches that we have. These are the common paradigms you'll see in the third column that are often used within clinical education research. Positivism is going to feel the most comfortable and familiar to most of us. It's where you have this idea that there is one objective reality, a single reality, and we can measure that if we are neutral enough and if the tools we use are neutral and bias-free enough. So I'm sure that's ringing a lot of bells, that this sounds kind of very quote unquote scientific and aligned with that scientific method. Often people will take that one step further and they'll say, well, actually, I'm a post-positivist because I think that there is a single reality. That makes sense to me. But we can only know it imperfectly because humans are imperfect. We can try and make ourselves objective and neutral, but we can never really fully do that because we're flawed human individuals. So they're the approaches that are most closely aligned with quantitative, statistical, numerical, often survey-based studies, or studies that work with large data sets. You then have a series of approaches, paradigms, where your more qualitative research sits. Probably most common is interpretivist approaches, into the interpretivist paradigm, which is sort of what it sounds like. It's about interpretation. It's about recognizing that there are multiple socially constructed realities. My reality is different from your reality. That's shaped by our social context, our previous experiences, and therefore we can't assume that there's going to be a one-size-fits-all explanation or a one-size-fits-all solution to some educational issues that we might encounter, for example. There are realist approaches to research, which are becoming more and more common within clinical education. And this sort of sits a little bit in between post-positivism and interpretivism on that spectrum of approaches. And it places a lot of value and emphasis on the mechanisms that connect our context with our outcomes. So looking at, say, an intervention, an educational intervention, what's the context of that intervention? What outcomes is it leading to? And what's the explanatory mechanism that takes us from that context to that outcome so that we can share that more broadly and enable that broader understanding of what works and why. We then have pragmatism, which again is quite a common approach in clinical education. I think a lot of us are pragmatic by nature. We're selected into these professions because we are pragmatic individuals. And that's about choosing what works to solve your problem. So you may cherry pick, actually. You don't have to strictly stay within the bounds of any one of these lenses. You just need to recognize what you're cherry picking from where and why. So I might say, actually, I want to do a survey and some interviews because a survey is going to be, as I said, really helpful for telling me the shape and the size of that problem, the frame of the picture, the jigsaw that I'm filling in. And then I'm going to add colour to those jigsaw pieces by speaking to some people that I recruit through that survey. That might sound like quite a common research design. It's something I commonly see. And that is often quite a pragmatic approach where you're bringing together in a mixed methods or a multiple methods way different types of data collection, different approaches from these different paradigms. As I said previously, reflecting on those assumptions that we hold is really important. We each will probably, when I was speaking, your ears probably pricked up and you thought, oh, actually, that sounds like me. Me, myself, I would say I'm mostly an interpretivist. That's where I feel most comfortable, the space that I feel most comfortable in. In clinical education research, we will often have to work in teams where we might be working in a different paradigm or with people who have very different ways of seeing the world than we do. Also, for investigating a problem, sometimes we need to work within a different paradigm. So we need that statistical understanding. I might need to work on a project. I have to work on projects where we need that initial statistical understanding. It's really beneficial. It speaks to different key stakeholders. And so I'll have to work within a post-positivist paradigm, but also knowing where I sit and sometimes how and why that makes me uncomfortable and what my tendencies are helps stop me from trying to make that project into something that it isn't and shouldn't be, into trying to drag it into interpretivism. Similarly, if you're someone who is most comfortable with numbers and that you're then working with interviews and stories, knowing that you're more comfortable with numbers and that you're more likely to want to try and reduce the meaning of those stories down into some sort of statistical patterns can stop you doing that and can help you work more faithfully within the paradigm and the method that you've chosen to help you answer your research questions. Reflecting on all of that and those assumptions that we hold is sometimes called reflexivity or positionality. You might see either of those terms. Reflexivity is probably the most common term. And we should all try and do that. Often it's helpful to do that in groups at the beginning of a project when you come together as a team. Who's in the research team? How do you each see things? Where are your strengths? And where might you need to actually do a little bit of prompting of one another to be aware that, oh, you know, Megan might not see so much value in those statistics, so I might know to pull her up if she makes a comment that doesn't actually sit well with the approach, or vice versa. So we have those labels that we assign to the paradigms, those technical names, the jargon names, and we all fall into one another of those categories. So we need to start sort of reflecting on where we fit. And as you become familiar with the terms, you'll be able to assign those labels and do that in a more structured way, but just having a general thought of, and we'll run through some questions that you can use to do that in a moment, is a really helpful start. I really like this slide, the research methodology tree. So as you'll see, we've talked about the foundations of clinical education research. That's the point of us having this webinar today. And really these assumptions that form your paradigm, your ontology, your epistemology at the base of the tree, the roots of the tree, they're the underpinning foundations to your research. So ontology, that what's real, that's about how we view the world. Do we believe that there is one reality that we can objectively know, or that there's multiple socially constructed realities? The epistemology is how then we should investigate that. So if I believe that there is one single reality, it makes sense that I would choose those positivist or post-positivist approaches where I'm trying to make myself as bias-free or as neutral as possible to get the closest representation or understanding of that singular reality that we're all living within. Whereas if I actually believe ontologically that there are multiple socially constructed realities, how I go about investigating that might be through some really a few in-depth interviews, a very small number of in-depth interviews with individuals who have very different experiences. I might choose someone who's had a really good experience of something and someone who's had a really bad experience of something, so I can try and develop an understanding. But you'll see how I would investigate that is different, because I believe that they're sharing, they're living in very different realities that are influenced by the social context that they're existing in. The ontology and the epistemology of your research then inform how you go about collecting that data, and the details of how you do that, which is the methodology and the methods of your work. So as I said, if you believe that, if you're a positivist and you believe that there is a single reality that we share, that we need to be bias free and neutral and objective to develop our understanding of that single reality, something like a survey, or looking at routinely collected data in a big national data set like the UK Med database, for example, a big data set that contains lots of clinical education data, is a really good way of doing that. You have lots of data that's sitting there, just or that you can collect and create, that will facilitate that. Whereas if I think that there's multiple versions of reality that are socially constructed, that I need to speak to specific groups of people in depth to develop my understanding of those multiple realities. In order to speak to them in depth, I'm probably not going to do a survey, or I'm probably not going to look at routinely collected statistical data. I need to go and talk to them. I might do focus groups, I might do in-depth interviews, I might get them to do more creative approaches like audio diaries. The sort of the world's your oyster a little bit when it comes to being creative around the methods of data collection that you could have. But the important thing is that this all aligns. It needs to all be part of the same tree. We can't be jumping, necessarily between trees, or if we are and we're being pragmatic and trying to bring things together, we need to have a really good rope between those trees to connect our reasons why we're moving between these different specific approaches to research. Now, I can see that there's quite a lot of people in the room, so I'll just wait for the nod from Hugh that we're going to do the chat waterfall rather than the breakout rooms for such a big group of individuals. I can't see Hugh, but yeah.
Yes, that's
Yes,
right. We'll chat.
okay, brilliant.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks, Hugh. So we had some options here. We didn't know how big a group of people we were going to be exactly today. So we're going to do a chat waterfall. I don't know if people have done this before, maybe not. It was something new to Hugh when I explained it this morning. So it might just be something from my brain. What I would like you to do is look at these questions on screen. Don't type anything into the chat just yet. What brought you to clinical education research? Why are you here at this webinar today? Why are you interested? Some of you might have already begun to explain that in the chat. Do you lean more naturally towards facts and figures, stories, or do you prefer a mix? And how comfortable are you with uncertainty, with working in the grey zone of creating knowledge and creating understanding? So if you all type that into the chat box, but don't press send yet. So just type it into the chat, and then I'm going to get everyone to press send at the same time, hopefully. And what that should do is, when we have the chat open, is create a waterfall effect where everything comes in at once. It's just a kind of nifty visual thing that I find fun. So it's okay. Yeah. Okay, I'm opening the chat. Okay, so don't post in the chat just yet. It's okay if you have already, don't worry. But type into the chat what brought you to clinical education research. Do this all in the same paragraph. Do you lean towards facts and figures, stories, or a mix? And how comfortable are you with uncertainty? Okay to be completely honest. And hopefully this is another way, once we have all of this information in the chat, that we can maybe identify people with shared interests, common interests, and connect with one another. So I'm just going to give you a minute to do that, and then I'll say send. Don't send them yet, but when I say send, we'll all send them at the same time. I'm going to give people just a minute. Right. I am hoping that that's enough time for everyone to have written something into the chat box. So press send, please. See if this works. Oh, here we go. Oh, brilliant, it's working. I don't know if anyone else can see this all coming in. This is very exciting. Brilliant. Thank you, everybody, for doing that. It's great. I would encourage you. So this is going to be obviously quite a big chat. There are quite a lot of us here today. We will save the transcript from this chat. What I can see is a lot of discussion of curiosity within the chat, and some really wonderful honesty about about how people are not that comfortable with uncertainty, which I completely appreciate, and I think that's really very natural with getting started with clinical education research, especially since a lot of us come from scientific backgrounds. Great, thank you. So we'll leave those up there in the chat, and I would encourage you to go through and have a look through everybody else's responses. But really interesting that a lot of us seem to be on a similar page, that you're interested in getting started, you want to know more about how to often how to develop a career within clinical education research. A lot of people leaning towards a mix of stories and numbers, but also a sort of a discomfort with uncertainty in general terms. And maybe I think some of the content in this webinar can help you get started with unpicking sometimes our uncertainty is as a result of not knowing how to get started and not knowing what the terms are and where to find support. And hopefully we'll be able to help with that a little bit. I won't say we'll be able to help with it completely, because I think there's an inherent uncertainty to our existence as people, but also to clinical education research that we can never fully eradicate, but we can definitely provide some tools and resources that hopefully will help increase your own comfort and confidence in the field. So I'm just going to move on, but do have a look through the chat at each other's responses and see if anyone else is on the same page as you are. One of the things that often comes up when I give talks like this, or when I talk to students about some of these more philosophical concepts that underlie our research, is how is this practical? How does this help us actually do research better? And for those of you who are involved in the day-to-day aspects of training, that might be a question that you have in your mind. How can any of these philosophical underpinnings of research actually be applied practically to my work? So considering the practical problems and the questions that you face as an educator, which I'm sure, I've seen in the chat that some of you are preparing proposals and you have ideas for research. So you have some idea of what those questions that you want to ask about clinical education are. You have an idea of what some of the issues in education you would like to tackle are. But then considering how different paradigms could be used to approach those problems or those questions in different ways, that's actually a really practical way that we can think about paradigms before we get started on that research design. And as you said, that will set you up really well from moving from a topic or a vague idea to something more concrete, or actually having several options, several things that you could do and might do at various points in time. So for some various sort of real world examples at different levels of education, at a kind of individual educator level, a course level, and then a program level, we've got some examples on screen of different approaches that align with different paradigms. I'll be able to share these slides in the recording so you can come back to this. The different shapes are how you might approach these problems through different paradigm lenses, through positivist, post-positivist, interpretivist, and then a more critical lens, which we haven't covered in as much depth today, but is a development of an interpretivist approach using more of an EDI lens. But I just wanted to put this up to demonstrate the different ways of seeing the world and how that shapes the questions that you ask. If we take the example at the bottom, so this is for individual educators. So say you're an educator who is wanting to understand the impact of a workshop that you've done on burnout management, for example, for students. The workshop could be on anything. But how do you do this? Well, if you took a quantitative approach, you could find an inventory to measure burnout over time, right? You could compare the results of that inventory with learners who didn't take your workshop. If you're taking more of a qualitative, interpretivist approach with a focus on stories, you might do some focus groups with students to understand the impact of the workshop. You might interview them one-on-one to see if the workshop met all of their diverse needs. So learning the language of clinical education research and reflecting on your own position can help you make those practical choices about the projects that you do, about the questions that you ask, and being mindful of that enhances the rigor and the clarity of our work so that we can talk to other researchers who also know about these paradigms. It's a sort of shorthand way for us communicating efficiently and rigorously with one another. There's a few helpful references. Again, you'll receive these slides, so don't feel like you have to note these down. The top one there is what I've already shared with you, the glossary for getting started with some of the research terminology. There's a really helpful series in the journal, The Clinical Teacher, which just so happens to be where that glossary is also published, on how to get started with qualitative research for those interested. The third resource on screen is a more detailed deep dive into some of that philosophy. I wouldn't recommend starting there. I'd work up to that one, but it is helpful to have on the back burner. And the fourth one is a little bit of a shameless plug, given I'm a co-editor of the recently published Oxford Handbook of Medical Education in Practice, but there are some chapters in that book, again, at quite an entry level, around using theory and around doing research within clinical education. Next step, so as you take this forward and as you begin to increase your own familiarity and develop your understanding of these terms, these ideas, where you sit, how that might influence your research, it's really helpful to just get engaged and involved with the literature of clinical education research. Some of you might already be doing this or doing more than this, but if you're not, I would find a clinical education journal, research journal, one of, pick one or move between them. There's a few really high quality ones there up on screen that publish really great pieces of research in clinical education. Find a paper that just is interesting to you, the title speaks to you, or the topic is something that you're interested in. And as you read it, make a note, try and identify, what is the research question? What's the paradigm of the study? People don't always say. That's an important thing to say. People are getting better at doing that now and saying that in their methods, but they might not always make that clear. You might have to try and work it out from what they've done. Think about their approaches to data collection and analysis. So see if you can identify and make those clear. And just doing that and developing your understanding of, they were interested in that topic and this is why, and therefore that's the methods that they used. That helps you build a series of examples and cases in your own mind of how these different paradigms apply and impact work. And developing that and being steeped in that will help inform your own design practice. Think also about whether the research team in whatever paper you're reading has been reflexive in conducting their research. So again, people are getting better and better at making clear their assumptions. They might have a reflexivity statement in the methods section of their paper, but they don't always make clear. And when you're aware of it, it becomes quite jarring if you read a paper and you haven't actually got a clue about who's written it and why. So if that is missing over time, that will really sort of stick out like a sore thumb to you in terms of reading it and thinking, well, actually, I don't know who has written this paper or done this research, why they were interested in it. And that can make it quite difficult to interpret their recommendations in particular. Who is making these recommendations? Is it a fellow educator? Is it someone at an organizational leadership level? Is it patients? Like, all of these things matter in terms of how we interpret those recommendations and whether and how we take them forward into our own practice. So to revisit the top tips, so I gave you those kind of 3 key things that I hope you would take away with today. I would maintain that number 1 is about making collaborations, reaching out and finding people. I'll take you through in the next few slides how you could use the directory as within the clinical education incubator to do that. But there might also be people in the chat, don't be afraid to direct message someone and ask for an email address. It can feel a bit scary to put yourself out there, but it's how I've made some of my best collaborations, actually, is just to randomly reach out to somebody on social media, at a conference, via email, and ask, say, we've got things in common, wouldn't it be great to chat and connect? Lots of reading, so getting familiar with that clinical education literature base, what topics are coming up time and time again, what methods and methodological approaches are common, and developing your own understanding not only of what they are, but also how people write about them, because a lot of the time our goal is to have an impact, right? One way of doing that is writing and sharing our research. So I imagine, and there are later sessions on, writing and publication, but I imagine that's an ultimate goal for a lot of us. So beginning now and starting to get familiar with that literature base is really helpful. To do that, you can get alerts and sign up for the sort of the newsletters and updates for clinical education research journals. That's quite a low effort way of receiving updates on what's being published. Similarly, you can do that on Google Scholar. You can set alerts for topics that you're interested in or keywords, and you can get emails to your inbox. So it makes it really easy way to just see quickly if there's anything that's been recently published that you're interested in. Don't rush into a project. As I said before, it's really tempting when you've got an idea or you've identified an issue to say, that's it, that's where I know I need to go, and to sort of skip out doing some of this foundational work. But it does come back to bite you later on. You get peer review comments that it's not clear what you did or why you did it, or you haven't made clear, or your assumptions are being reflexive, and it's not really something you can do in retrospect. You can reflect on these things in retrospect, but if you've done things that cross paradigms and you haven't done that intentionally, that's not something you can fix in retrospect. So putting in the time and the effort and the legwork to getting that right from the offset is really important. And then the final point around using the directory. So this is on our website. It is essentially a map of individuals who've asked to be added to our directory, who are engaged or interested in clinical education research across the UK. So you'll be able to see where people are based, but you'll also be able to see what their professional background is. And when you click on more info, so I go, oh yes, that person seems really interesting. I'm gonna find out a bit more about them. You'll not only be able to see who they are and where they're based, you'll be able to access their ORCID ID. So for those who aren't familiar with ORCID, that's a platform that collects people's research outputs. And so you can access their papers and see what type of research that they're doing. As I said, you can see their professional background. So we don't just have doctors, Ray has got a nursing background as an example here. You can also see the areas of research that they've said they're interested in and what they're happy to be contacted about. So this is a great way of finding, as Ray is shown on screen here, is interested in supervising research degrees, mentoring early career researchers, mentoring supervisors, being an external examiner, providing peer review. So there's an offer there. There is a huge network of individuals who are ready and willing and able to be contacted, using the directory to find out what their contact information is, and approaching them is a really great place to start. The other thing to say is that if you want to be added to this directory, just let the incubator know by email and you can yourself be put on this map. This is the QR code to the directory. You can also just find it directly through the clinical education incubator website. It's there as a tab at the top of the website. But I would really encourage you as a starting point, if you're feeling like a bit of an island. That's quite a common feeling in clinical education research. There's lots of people doing really great research in separate institutions. The incubator is a wonderful way of bringing people together and connecting people on shared topics or shared methods of interest. Thank you so much for your time. That is our email address if you would like to get in touch about anything that we've discussed today. The directory with feedback for a certificate for attending today's webinar. But I'll leave it there and hand back over to Hugh.